Hey everyone, welcome to Sociastrology. Today I wanted to look at the Jupiter retrograde that we'll be experiencing from the 9th of October through the 4th of February next year. We will take this through and look at what we can expect from it, both on a personal level and on a political and geopolitical level, and additionally look into a lot of the patterns that this is bringing to us. The retrograde itself displays a very significant pattern related to Mercury, and then the shadow period indicates a pretty big pattern with regard to Uranus. So these are things that we'll definitely want to dive into because there's some interesting kind of omen orientation here in terms of some very strong messages that are coming through with it. So I want to take us through all of that. But before we dive into it, if you are new here, please do consider subscribing if you're interested in content like this, political, geopolitical, cultural astrology, as well as long-term transits. I would love to have you here for future videos. And if you don't mind hitting the thumbs up button, I would really appreciate that. It helps me out with the algorithm. It brings the video to more people. And so it helps the channel to grow, and I very much appreciate that. It also indicates to me what kind of content you like and what you'd like to see more of. So I very much appreciate all of that. And without any further ado, let's dive into it. So let's go through some of the dates first. Now, we will have the retrograde officially begin on the 9th of October, but we will be in a stationary period where Jupiter is more or less not moving from the 7th through the 11th of October. So Jupiter is going to be at a standstill at 21 degrees and 20 minutes of Gemini during that whole period of time from the 7th to the 11th of October. So we'll come back around to it, but I do want to reiterate, or rather iterate for the first time off the bat here, that if you do have any planets around this degree point, 21 degrees, give or take, say a few, in any of the mutable signs, so Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, Pisces, as well as the air signs, Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius, these are going to be affected pretty strongly by this. We can even see that playing out with Aries and Leo as well. So if you have anything that's around those degrees, you'll definitely want to pay attention to this quite closely because we have Jupiter essentially just putting it in park for several days at this point. And that is a very powerful position for Jupiter to be in. It's just really owning that space, and it's acting from that space in a very, very powerful way. From our vantage point, it's just not moving. And additionally, we'll see that happen in a very similar way from the 2nd to the 7th of February of next year at 11 degrees and 16 minutes of Gemini. So again, give or take a few degrees on each side, any of the signs that I mentioned just a moment ago, you're also going to want to look at that period of time very, very closely. Now, if that was the case for you, if you have planets around this point in any of those signs that I mentioned, of course, what you'll want to look back to in particular is around the 15th of July of this year, Jupiter already went through that point. And that's when the shadow, quote unquote, begins. And what that basically means is I have this set to that point. This is July 15th, right? So we'll go through all of the charts here, but we had Jupiter at this point and it was affecting your chart the way that it will affect your chart when it's here. So this is really the best time to look toward to see some of what's going to be developing for you throughout this period, and especially in February. And we'll also talk a little bit more about why this date is so significant. Now, similarly, again, if you have any planets around that 21-20 point of Gemini, any of those signs, then this is a big moment for you currently. But we will also come right back around to the same influence on April 30th of next year. So that's when the shadow period ends. So Jupiter was here. It moves forward to 21 degrees. It then moves backward to 11 degrees, and then it continues to move through. And when it hits that 21 degree point again, that's when the shadow ends. So that's what that refers to. So we'll get into more particulars about this, how this impacts our personal lives shortly, but I do want to go through some of the fixed stars that are associated with this retrograde period because they're pretty significant stars. And off the bat, we're dealing with four. So Jupiter at the station point, it's going to be sitting there parked pretty much on four different stars that are pretty significant. So the first one we'll mention will be Bellatrix, which is in Orion. And this is associated with military honors, but also a risk of rashness, and through that rashness, dangers of sudden dishonor. So we want to make sure that we're not being rash during this period of time, and especially so because with Mars in Cancer, as I've just gone through in a recent video, that is also one of the risks of Mars in Cancer. So this is something that we want to really watch out for, especially during these days, is to just not react to things in an emotional or reactive, harsh kind of way. Additionally associated with this star is lucky, strong, forceful women who are very good with language in terms of having kind of silver tongues, but also kind of sharp tongues. And it brings fortune to women like that. So if you are like that, I certainly associate myself with that kind of characterization, then this should be a lucky time for you. And again, we want to avoid rashness, but that should at least be effective for you. And if you are typically timid, this can encourage you to speak up for yourself much more as well. So Bellatrix refers to a female warrior. And additionally associated with this star are legal topics and legal honors, but also slander that comes along with that as somehow associated with those honors, but almost in an envious way, where it's because of those honors that someone becomes slandered. Now, because we have Capella is so close in the sky to Bellatrix, it also carries a lot of the very similar associations with it. This is what the ancients would basically look to the sky and say, okay, this very part of the zodiac, which spans for a few degrees, is going to have this kind of characterization. So it's much tighter in terms of how it's divvied up in the sky than, say, signs. And it's also much more particular the way that they interpret these things. So you'll see a somewhat similar characterization here of its very beneficial star, Capella, in Auriga, and especially intellectually. Now, this is a small female goat among three goats that are being held by a charioteer in the sky. And so it is also associated with and fortunate for things that we might associate with a diminutive kind of characterization of a female thing. So small female things, including young girls and so forth. And again, there's an association of rashness with this, a risk of that. So again, we want to watch out for that. And then additionally, legal honors, but slander. These are very fortunate stars, but all stars come with pluses and minuses. And for these stars, it's rashness and potential backlash due to your own successes. Now, we additionally have two more stars that are conjunct to this small area of the sky, and those are Phact and Mintica. And Phact, which if I'm pronouncing any of these incorrectly, please feel free to correct me, Phact is part of the Columba constellation, which is the dove. It's associated with like Noah's dove, and it represents good news, receiving good news, messages of good news. And additionally, something that Ebertine, the elder, I'm forgetting her name, this is Reinhold Ebertine's mother, who was also an astrologer. She said about this star that it is assumed that it will gain importance with the beginning of the Aquarian age. Now, I'm not sure exactly what she's basing that on, but that is pretty fascinating considering the fact that we have this Jupiter in this retrograde cycle where it's also square to Saturn. And these two are in one of their earlier major aspects that they'll be making from the point at which in December of 2020, they were conjunct at 0 degrees of Aquarius. And additionally, that this retrograde period is ushering in the final entry of Pluto into Aquarius where it will be for almost 20 years. And so, in that sense, considering the fact that we have now finally, after centuries of Jupiter and Saturn always being conjunct within Earth signs, we will now, going forward from December of 2020, we will have these two conjunct in air signs. So we are entering an air age. We additionally will have next year Uranus moving into Gemini. So there's a lot of indications of, even if this isn't the quote unquote Aquarian age, and I can get into that more in a future video if you guys are curious. As far as I'm concerned, we're on the cusp of that, but we're not quite there yet. We are ushering in a lot of Aquarian and air sign energy in the coming years. So I think that that is quite relevant. And I think that it is yet another indication among many recently that we are really turning a page as a global civilization into a new collective cultural orientation. So again, additionally, we have Mintica here, which is the westernmost star of Orion's belt. And that is also a very fortunate star. But as with pretty much all stars in Orion, it is associated with combativeness. So it is something to keep in mind that we have these pretty martial stars that are presenting themselves to us with this station here. And that'll also become a little bit more relevant as we get into national charts and compare this retrograde to their charts. So with that said, when Jupiter finally stations direct at 11 degrees and 16 minutes, it will be conjunct to what I would like to argue is one of the most significant stars in the sky. It's the star that was rising when I was born. So this is right around where my ascendant is. So I love this star. It's also the subject of an Enya song that's absolutely beautiful that I certainly recommend if you ever want to like listen to it on Spotify. It's spelled this way, and you can just search that and find it. It's one of the Bohemian stars, and it's additionally one of the 4 royal stars that were used as a very significant part of Persian astrology since like 3000 BC. So this is a very important star, Aldebaran, and it's in the constellation Taurus. It is the leading eye of Taurus, and it's kind of right around it's near, of course, the forehead of the bull there. And of course, I should point out, because of precession, that the stars of Taurus are now in the sign of Gemini. All of the stars are a little bit farther along in the zodiac than the signs are now, because with tropical astrology, we go by seasons, we don't go by stars. So the stars shift signs, and this is now in Gemini. So again, this is the Watcher of the East. We have across from that, if you want to know the other the 4 big stars, would be Antares is approximately on the opposite side of that in Sagittarius. And then additionally, we have Regulus is around 0 degrees of Virgo currently. And then we have, I think it's around 2 or so degrees of Pisces is Fomalhaut. Fomalhaut. Sorry, I'm always terrible with that one. So those are like 4 major stars, and this is one of those. So this is considered a hugely significant star, really, really highly fortunate, but also subject to vicissitude. So for instance, huge honors and then lulls, and then honors and then lulls, and so on and so forth. So there's also an association due to the seasonality of when this star is rising at sunrise. It's associated with the rain, though of course the seasons shift in tropical astrology as regards the stars. And this is also associated with restlessness in kind of all forms of that word. The difficult ones like anxiety, but then also the more productive ones of always wanting to be doing something significant. But there can additionally, with this star, be a tendency toward trying to fight for a cause and possibly overlooking the fact that it it might be, let's say, a bit of a Pyrrhic victory if you were to win it, you know? So you want to watch out a little bit with any sort of combativeness, again, on either side of this retrograde period. So let's dive into this. Now, I can finally point out why I think that the shadow of this is super significant too. So, one thing that I think, I know that I noticed this at some point, but I don't think I ever mentioned it, which is that the shadow period of the Jupiter retrograde started virtually, yeah, it was on the day that Mars and Uranus were conjunct. And that was a huge conjunction. So that played out in many, many different ways. One, we had the first Trump assassination attempt was around that point. JD Vance was picked as the VP. Joe Biden stepped down and Kamala Harris stepped in for him a, a bit after this, within about a week of this period. So this was extraordinarily active in US politics, but additionally I think that we saw a lot more weird reactiveness and shockingly honest in a bad way, maybe, if that's, I don't know if it's like bad, the honesty, but what's being said is bad, where we had the filters come off from a lot of people. And I did notice that rhetoric has gotten worse since this point, without a doubt. And I mean that in terms of the ongoing conflicts in the world, but additionally, with regard to, let me put it this way, I saw a lot of nationalism come out with this in a way that wasn't that pretty. So we'll put it that way. And that was, of course, on the fixed star of Algol. So that's something we also want to keep in mind, is that that's right around that 26-degree point as well. Now, notice that Jupiter here, once it's stationed, was in a flowing aspect to both the north node as a sextile and to the south node in a trine here. That's also going to be pretty important. And also notice that we have, just coming into orb here, within 8 degrees, a square that is applying to Saturn. That's also going to become increasingly relevant as we continue to look through the various periods. So let's look at now, which is going to be the beginning of the retrograde. So this is at 21 degrees and 20 minutes of Gemini. We will almost be there at the point that I publish this video. And like I said, we're just going to sit at that point for quite a while with Jupiter. This here is from the 9th. Now we have actually some very nice aspects that we'll see with the retrograde period itself. And something that will be a pattern here will be trines to Mercury and the Sun, with Mercury being exact on both sides. It's about a degree and 18 minutes off here. So it's really, really close. And then immediately when it starts to move backward, it's going to be in what's called mutual application, where the Sun is moving forward and Jupiter is moving backward, and they're tightening this trine, and they will cross each other while going in opposite directions, but they'll cross each other directly that way. Additionally, we have what was a separating square between Jupiter and Saturn here. Once this goes retrograde, then we start to get to applying again. We also have Jupiter moving into orb with a square of Neptune. But the reason that I point that out, this is an S because it's separating once Jupiter goes retrograde. And this is with an A, which is applying. And that'll be applying pretty close to once Jupiter starts to get moving. And for all intents and purposes, throughout the retrograde period, Jupiter will be applying to Saturn, and it's moving away from Neptune now. So it will not complete that square until next summer. So it's just come within orb, and then it's leaving it until next summer. Additionally, we have a sextile here between Jupiter and Chiron, which is really close at the moment of this retrograde. And that right there is going to hold as a sextile well into November. So we're going to have this for a while. Additionally, we have an opposition to the moon in Sagittarius here. So let me break this down a little bit. So what we have here is flowing aspects between the air signs here of Jupiter and Gemini to the Sun and Mercury in Libra. And this is really all about social agreement and coming to terms with things, positive and productive and considerate communications, which are intended to reach a goal and intended to reach a level of compromise. With the opposition to the moon here, this lightens the mood quite a bit. Whenever we have whenever we have the moon in Sagittarius, that in and of itself is going to lighten the mood, but to have it in that opposition where it's just passed through during this day, that opposition with Jupiter, that really lightens things up even more so. And so for one thing, I can say in particular about this day, when we get close to the 9th, the energies as we experience them in our personal lives, let me say, should be pretty lighthearted and should be quite pleasant, really. We should be able to, even if we don't see fully eye to eye with others, to peaceably agree to disagree and still get along. Similarly, with the ongoing sextile between Jupiter and Chiron, we have a very long period of time that is super conducive to any sort of healing work and additionally any learning or education, anything with regard to one's health, whether it be mental or physical or spiritual, emotional, is all really, really favored. So if there's anything that you need to work on therapeutically, even if a question of psychology or emotional concerns and you're not in therapy, any work that you do to that end should be highly effective in ways that are atypical. So much more effective than you would expect. If you, for instance, want to get into yoga or meditation, or you want to learn about those things, and typically you find them maybe a little bit boring, as I think, a lot of us tend to. I try to do my exercise and yoga every day, but sometimes I just kind of put it off and it's not something that's like calling out to me. So sometimes I'll skip a day or whatnot. But under this influence, it should be feeling a lot more enjoyable. That's one thing, is that any sort of healing is going to feel very fulfilling, enjoyable, like there's not much hindrance, and should also be experienced in a way where it's like you get it. So if that's been something that you've struggled with, really with any topic of just kind of getting something or just kind of understanding something, this can be really, really helpful in that regard. These are also two planets that are strongly associated with education, learning, and teaching, and especially teaching things that were difficult for one to learn. So if that's something that's been calling you, if that's something that you've been feeling like maybe you're wanting to get into, then I would look to utilize this through November to dig into that just fully. And I mean, you can completely immerse yourself in this, and it's going to feel really good and very productive. Now, lastly, we'll deal with these squares to these planets that are in Pisces. And let's talk a little bit more about that square between Jupiter and Gemini and Saturn and Pisces. So Jupiter is pretty much going to be chasing around that square. So these planets will square each other, as far as I know, I think it's more than 3 times, because they're both going retrograde and because Jupiter keeps chasing after Saturn. And this aspect is, one, it's indicative of the development of projects that we have started, or personal development efforts that we started in approximately December of 2020 when they were conjunct. So they are now in another major aspect that's holding for a while. And this is all about continuing to strive to create within your life structures and routines that genuinely work for you, where you're balancing enjoyment and discipline, such that you're able to pursue your goals, again, especially those that you've had from around 2020, in order to create productive flows within your life that are highly sustainable and that will get you to where you're wanting to go. That's how we feel this aspect pattern, or this aspect rather, between Jupiter and Saturn in our own lives, in mundane astrology and political astrology, this is one of the most significant alignments that we can have, are these hard aspects between Jupiter and Saturn, because these two together more or less equal governance. So these are huge questions of governance, questions of authority and freedom, questions of any branch of government, about the integrity of the government, about the cultural ideas and social health or illness that we're experiencing, and whether or not it's sustainable, or whether down the road it indicates some sort of cultural or social breakdown. This is also highly influential over the economy. So it tends to rein in areas where there's been an overgrowth. So something that comes to mind as a perfect example of that to me is the overinvestment that we saw recently in some tech startups, where there was, to use a term that is newly topical, like concepts of a plan around what an app would do. Or there was an app that would do something, but maybe they hadn't even considered, is there a market for this? Does anyone even want this? And there were these venture capital institutions and even banks that invested wildly in a lot of these startups and wound up losing a huge amount of money due to that. So that is an overgrowth that then kind of had to fall in a way that, of course we don't love to see, because it can affect people's jobs and so on and so forth, but it wasn't sustainable. And so one thing that I always try and point out with the Jupiter Saturn connection, which is going to be very important throughout this Jupiter retrograde period as well, is that this is ultimately helpful. Yeah, we've got to bring some discipline to the things that we enjoy, but it's going to make it work for us. It's going to make it to where we can incorporate more of what we enjoy into our lives, because it's more sustainable, because it's more productive. And so we can see that similarity on a personal level as well as on a social level. And very lastly, what we're essentially doing with the square between Jupiter and Neptune is putting it off. We're putting it off for a while. It won't be until, I want to say, July of next year that these two will be in contact. And I think at that point that Neptune will actually be a little bit into Aries. So these two might not even meet in these signs, if I'm remembering correctly. I'll put a note about that. I think they might be meeting in the early degrees of Aries and Cancer, but they are seeing each other right now. And these two together, for one thing, they're both planets that are associated with Pisces, but they're also huge big picture planets. I mean, take the big picture of Jupiter and, blow it up 1,000 times and soften the edges and apply like 15 blur effects. And that's a lot of what Neptune has to do with. So it can be a heavy hitter. It has a huge amount of influence, but it's very ethereal in how it behaves. And when these two come together, they can have a huge amount of cultural influence, massive amounts. And when they're in square, what we will most likely see is one, just some probably really incredible art coming out, likely some pushback from establishment figures to that, and additionally a cultural turning point. And when I say culture, I mean more along the lines of the fashion and the trends, the fads, and how people express themselves, like our direct expressive and sentimental engagement with culture, rather than so much questions of like governance and things like this that are also bound up with culture. So that's something that we're putting off right now, but it is worth looking at that, especially if you're a creative type. We can utilize this square to stir up some inspiration and to, I think, interrogate it in a way where our ideas can be effectively interrogated on grounds of authenticity, such that we can push ourselves out of boxes that others haven't, and we can have some pretty groundbreaking ideas on a personal level with regard to our creative pursuits. So that's the beginning of the retrograde period. Let's take it forward a bit to when the retrograde period ends. Again, this is in February of next year. And when we're at 11 degrees and 16 minutes of Gemini, notice what we have again. Very similar pattern here. So we have a trine to Mercury again. Remember, we had that trine that was pretty much exact in Libra. So we have a trine that's pretty much exact now in Aquarius on the other side. And again, I'll point out that that Mercury was at like 22 degrees over here, and now it's at like 12 degrees. And it followed with Jupiter from 21 degrees to about 11 degrees. So we have that pretty much exact aspect to Mercury, which again is wonderful in particular because it's Mercury that's ruling Jupiter. So these two here have a generally really famous relationship throughout this entire retrograde period. Mercury is more or less going to be in signs that it's pretty comfortable with. Sagittarius is its detriment, but because of the fact that it's going to be in a mutual reception relationship with Jupiter throughout that period, and we'll get into that in a second, even that's comfortable for it. And then it's going to be coming around here and making these flowing aspects to it. So all we have is an opposition, which is actually great, and we'll get into why in a moment. But we also then have these flowing trine aspects between air signs with these two. And as we saw on the other side, the Sun and Jupiter were about to make a trine aspect. They've just made a trine aspect, and they're now moving on from that. And remember how last time that Jupiter was in a square aspect that was about to be applying when it went retrograde to Saturn. Now, when it goes direct, it will again be applying to Saturn. So we have these really strong patterns around this retrograde that I think we can look to give us a lot of information about what it's essentially trying to accomplish for us here, again, globally and personally. And what does that have to do with? So between Mercury and Jupiter, they have actually a much more wonderful relationship than we might expect, considering the fact that they rule opposite signs always. So all of the mutable signs are ruled either by Mercury or Jupiter. And so they do find themselves in detriment in each other's signs. But we do need to keep in mind, one, there's no malefics involved in the rulerships of the mutable sign. Rather, what we have are these two planets that are all about exchange. They're all about communication and socialization and finding ways to make things fit. They simply go about it in very different ways and in very, very complementary ways. So Jupiter tends to look for room to bring things together kind of like collectively or communally, like, hey, this is a big tent. We can take all manner of different types of things in. It loves to say yes. Whereas Mercury is kind of always going to give a maybe, and it's going to evaluate something. And what it's going to try and do is break things down into smaller categories and try to make those pieces fit together in a way that's logical, where it's not just a yes, it's going to go through something logically, and it'll probably, unless it's in a very bad mood, look to try to make something fit. It's going to look for a yes, but it's not going to just offer one the way that Jupiter would do if it doesn't make sense. So these two are really all about trying to find room for things to work, especially when it comes to social matters. They're both strongly associated with travel, with exchange, with commerce, with communication and negotiation. Between the two of them, you can get a lot of court filings and a lot of communication around big institutional questions. Now, when it comes to Jupiter and the Sun, in these air signs, these are considered warm planetary bodies, so to say, astrologically speaking, in terms of the ancients. These were both considered to be warm and, of course, associated with fire. They both rule fire signs, and they do very well in fire signs. But here they're in air signs. So these, additionally, are much more socially oriented than they typically are. So there's an ability with these alignments here, the trine between Jupiter and the Sun in these air signs to find some enjoyment and find some sense of personal expression and personal identity within regard to social relationships. So that's where that's being found. That's where the self is being found, is within these kind of social and cultural milieus which we are moving through. So extraordinarily socially oriented period of time here with this Jupiter retrograde. And additionally, again, we are continually confronted with major questions that we're probably already tired of dealing with here, of the economy and the government and how things are going to be going forward. Even for institutions, there's such an up in the air feeling in the States right now, and I'm sure in many other countries, because there's been just a huge amount of elections this year all around the planet, like many dozens of elections. So even that can contribute to a sense of things being on hold for the time being, while bigger powers, the powers that be, so to say, with Jupiter and Saturn in this hard aspect to each other, sort things out so that we can decide and figure out for ourselves individually, personally, but also in terms of lesser institutions which are subject to laws and governments and so on, for them to even figure out what their next steps are going to be. So these are all major questions. Again, sustainability of things in terms of personal discipline and effort, while also not squelching out the fun of an activity, especially if it's a productive activity, say in terms of work or personal projects. And so the big questions that are always looming throughout this period of time about the government and the economy going forward, and how that's going to affect institutions and people. And then also this general increased enjoyment and flow of communication and socialization, and a general ability to come to some collective enjoyment of each other and exchanging ideas with each other, communication, as well as general cultural trends and things like this where we're communicating about them and so forth. Now, taking this to when the shadow ends, what we will see in this is mirrored in when the shadow began back in July. So again, remember, flowing aspects to the nodal axis, the Mars Uranus conjunction here at 26 degrees. Notice that Uranus is at 26 degrees and 19 minutes, and then additionally the square to Saturn. So let's go over here, and what we'll see is that we now have squares to the nodal axis. So we are again with Jupiter making this very consequential big aspect pattern with the nodes, where it's at this apex point between the nodes. And what that points to is generally fortunate, globally significant events and unfoldings tend to take up a lot of space and feel just very, very consequential. So for instance, again, what we saw when the shadow began was the whole shakeup of the whole presidential race in the US, as just one minor example. And the fact that this really shook things up even globally, of, okay, wait, who's running for president in the US, and is there a broader danger there? And really, like, how is the election going to play out? Late next April, we will be seeing something probably much more significant even, that's really going to shake things at that point. So a huge news event of global significance is very likely around that point. This is going exact in terms of the return to that retrograde point where it finally leaves shadow, April 30th of 2025. And again, notice that we still have this square to Saturn, because Jupiter's been chasing Saturn back and forth. Saturn went retrograde, and then Jupiter went retrograde, and it's chased it back and forth, and they've gone back and forth together, more or less. So they've been in this square formation for a very, very long time, and that remains. And again, this brings up, especially considering the fact that this is now so closely conjunct to that north node there. This is quite significant to have Saturn that close to the north node. And what that indicates, especially with the squares to Jupiter, is that this is without a doubt governance related. This could be, I'll give you some specifics since we're talking April. One thing is there are some weird things going on in Trump's transits, as well as some additional predictive techniques as applied to his own chart that do point to April as highly significant for him for some reason. We could additionally see threats or breakdowns or fissures to governments with an alignment like this in terms of its significance, or the even reinstatement of a kind of authority that may have been broken down at some point. We could see major developments, hopefully good, in wars that are taking place in the world. This would really, really hopefully not indicate to us any sort of spillover into broader wars, though, again, I can't rule that out. And that would be one of the ways that one could potentially take this to indicate. What there is here in this T-square formation that we have between the moon will be here temporarily, but this is going to be stationed for some days between Jupiter, the nodes, and Saturn, is a hugely critical issue arising with regard to governance in a part of the world that is going to have ramifications globally. Looking at the end of the shadow in particular here, it is worth noting that the moon has come around to join Jupiter at this moment. And that increases the likelihood that there's some level of sentimental enjoyment, at least for some people, with regard to some of the developments that are going on during this period of time, around April of next year, and potentially even some level of relief. So hopefully this moon coming around to this Jupiter is really indicative of the solution to a problem rather than that a problem is necessarily arising, though this T-square could go either way. In any case, it indicates a general involvement in the general public in major events. So people are generally emotionally invested one way or another in what is going on here. So people will be paying attention to this. This isn't something that's going to go under the radar. This will be something that people will be talking about, and that's going to have a pretty significant effect on things going forward. So we'll want to be looking at this time with regard to that now. Additionally, notice where Uranus is. It's at 26 degrees and 18 minutes. And it was at 26 degrees and 19 minutes when Jupiter entered shadow. So it's at virtually the exact same point. It has returned to this point. And I think that what this is indicating is that there may be some similarity in the topics that we're dealing with on April 30th as the topics that we were dealing with around July 15th. Again, as I pointed out, there are weird things going on with Trump's chart in April in particular, so this could have something to do with Trump since it did last time. But there were really a lot of developments throughout the world throughout that period of time as well. This was a very difficult summer for Palestine. A lot of nations were on edge. We had gains and losses on both sides with regard to Ukraine and Russia. We've also even had some pretty significant, even though it hasn't been super reported on a lot, tit for tat kind of push and pull activities between navies around China as well during this period of time. Again, as I've pointed out, a lot of elections have played out this year, so we could see something coming around with regard to one of the elections that took place in a close period of time. It would have been basically in July of 2024. So that is something that we're going to really want to keep in mind, is the similarity of the energy, but kind of amped up in a certain way, of April 30th to July 15th, because of the nodal connections, the implication of Saturn with Jupiter there, and then also the fact that for some reason Uranus is right back where we started when we entered the shadow. So some things that we really need to keep in mind going forward. So let's get into some of the aspects that we'll be experiencing throughout this whole period of time that can kind of give us an indication of how smaller periods of time of this retrograde will be going for us. So one thing that I love is that there's no interaction throughout this whole period because we have the outer planets are all in late degrees, and Mars is in Cancer, and it'll just step into Leo a little bit and then go back into Cancer. We don't have interference from any of them. So it's just Jupiter handling things with Saturn and the planets that are on the inside of them, which is a lot more straightforward than it could be if there were involvement of these other actors here. So again, we have the pretty much exact trine to Mercury as we open this. Again, super lovely that Mercury is ruling this Jupiter. This is a wonderful relationship for these two planets to have, and it sets the tone around the fact that this is going to be a very communicatively and socially open period of time throughout this whole Jupiter retrograde. And we also step straight into the mutual application of Jupiter with the Sun, which has a lot of similar energy to it. But these two together, Jupiter and then the Sun in Libra, really indicate a lot of legal developments. And with Mercury right here as well, again, we're going to want to look at court filings and things like that, developments around those throughout this early period in October of this Jupiter retrograde. Again, this sextile rather to Chiron is going to hold through November, and we want to take advantage of that whole time for any type of healing modalities, teaching, learning, healthy exchange, and development and improvement of our relationships with others throughout this whole period of time, as I already went through. So I won't belabor that too much. Now in November, we will have planets start to move into Sagittarius. And this, though it's an opposition, again, with mutable signs, because we're always dealing with Mercury and Jupiter, the oppositions and squares and such, they can be a little annoying, but they're not typically going to be super catastrophic. So the opposition to Venus is very lovely, especially because we have the two benefics as Venus moves into Sagittarius. They will be in opposition to each other and really looking to each other on a lot of matters. And when we have those two in communication with each other, that can put a really positive spin on any of the matters that we're dealing with. It's very fortunate to relationships, like in particular one-on-one relationships. Again, it lightens the mood when we have planets move into Sagittarius, and especially when they are in aspect to Jupiter. But additionally, what will be really wonderful about this is that we have then Venus is moving out of Scorpio, where it's been ruled by Mars in Cancer, which is a very difficult alignment there, to being ruled by Jupiter, being ruled by another benefic. And that ultimately is just going to feel a lot better. Now, we will additionally have 3 oppositions between Jupiter and Mercury when Mercury goes into Sagittarius. And I actually love this because what we will be seeing with that, and I think it's present in the next slide, so I'll show you that. Mercury will be in Jupiter's sign of Sagittarius, and Jupiter will be in Mercury's sign of Gemini. And they will both be retrograde at the same time through part of this, because Mercury is going to be retrograde specifically in Sagittarius this year, which I really, really love. Because again, all of those things that I mentioned about how Mercury and Jupiter interact with each other, where they're very socially oriented, they want to make things fit, they want to make them work, they want to think through things logically, or at least in a reasonable manner. They want to find places to compromise. And they also have a lot to do with things like travel and communication and exchange. So when they are in mutual reception to each other, even though they are quote unquote in detriment in each other's signs here, this is erased by the mutual reception, more or less speaking. In terms of dignities, it's just as strong to be in mutual reception with that other planet as it is a weakening effect or a complication to be in a sign that's opposite to your home. So they're in each other's homes. They've just exchanged homes is all. And so that strengthens Jupiter to have Mercury also in a Jupiter ruled sign while it is in Mercury's sign. So this is a boon for Jupiter. It's also a boon for Mercury because it's then able to engage directly with Jupiter also throughout this period of time as it goes through its retrograde. So again, we will have 3 oppositions between these two. The first is going to be in November. The second will be in early December, and the last will be in late December. So that whole period of time from late November to late December, there's a lot of opportunity for seeing eye to eye with people, agreeing to disagree, understanding that different people look at things in different ways and they don't have to be wrong just because they look at something differently. This is also just so excellent for any kind of study. It's really solid for travel, although when they're both in retrograde, you can definitely run into some major delays. But they'll probably be more positive or little serendipitous delays where things kind of wind up working out in an extra little weird way because of a delay. Additionally, again, communications just working out. And then also, if there are any miscommunications, we have a lot of opportunities to clean those up throughout this period of time with these 3 in mutual reception to each other, forming those oppositions. And again, I wouldn't worry about the fact that that is a quote unquote opposition. It's not problematic when they're dealing with each other in mutual reception in this way. It's just that there's a dynamic there that can, again, it's that being able to see that just because someone looks at something a different way doesn't mean that they're wrong. And additionally, that's when we get the opposition to the sun, which is also quite lovely because Jupiter is ruling the sun and it gets to exert a pretty big amount of influence over it while it's in Sagittarius and it's in opposition to it. So the sun itself, which is generally neutral to positive in terms of its influences, is generally speaking in a quite good mood throughout this period of time. This may actually be, for a lot of people, a much more sentimentally enjoyable holiday time than we might have expected. And, hopefully that indicates good news to come about all of the things that are up in the air right now, but we'll see. There might just even be a lot of fun and interesting conversation around that as well with this alignment. Now, additionally, in approximately the 3rd week of December, as this Venus moves into Aquarius, it will form a trine to this Jupiter. That is additionally quite lovely, and we'll have another perfect square between Saturn and Jupiter. So we're definitely coming to terms with whatever it is that we're needing to be sorting out at this point. It's just that we're going to continue to be pushed to continually refine our methods and the process by which we're trying to achieve our goals in order to make them increasingly efficient and sustainable going forward, as well as starting to come to terms with the grappling with social and cultural and governmental issues that are coming up as well during this period of time. Now, lastly, as we're wrapping up this retrograde, we have just a couple more aspects. And notice again, nothing to Mars, nothing to the outer planets. I love this. Nothing even to the nodes until we start to get back into that, like we're leaving the shadow period of time. So we will have a square in mid-January to Venus as, where is it? It's right here. It was just in Pisces in mid-January. This is when we have the retrograde ending. So it was just in Pisces and squaring Jupiter. Again, lovely. Jupiter will be ruling that Venus, and the Venus will be exalted in Pisces. So this is a really wonderful connection, which is very likely to help us creatively, financially, and in terms of our one-on-one relationships. It will serve as a very pleasant and strong boon to us in those ways. So we could come into money that we did not expect with that. And again, especially that with Venus in Pisces and square to this Jupiter because of the huge dignities that they both have in this sign. Deepening of sentimental relationships, a lot of grace with that aspect, and general social enjoyment and creative inspiration. And lastly, we just have that trine to the sun that we'll be experiencing on this side of it just before we station direct. And then we have that exact trine to Mercury once we are finally going direct again. So it's really, really lovely. Again, this retrograde is bookended by these really nice trines to the sun and Mercury. And again, we need to keep in mind that the shadow period is bookended by aspects to the nodal axis and for some reason Uranus being at 26 degrees and 18 or 19 minutes. So very weird and interesting, generally pretty lovely aspects and indications here in terms of the actual retrograde period. It's just that those periods just beyond that retrograde period before and after are looking a little bit more significant and potentially rough. So let's finally get into what we can expect from this whole period of time on a personal level. So first things first is second chances at missed opportunities. If there were opportunities that you had to pass on since June, July of 2024, we can get second chances at those, and not necessarily even like the exact same thing, but along the lines of things that we've been wanting to do and that we've been wanting to take advantage of. If we've missed out on any of those things because we've been doing something else or whatnot, there's a huge window of opportunity to take advantage of that and to be presented with that during this period of time. And again, once it goes direct again, then we get even more chances. So this is just kind of, again, it's elongating the window of opportunity here. What we can also see with Jupiter retrograde is a return of good things. So things that have maybe passed out of our lives that we have wanted to engage with again can return either in the same form or in different forms, where what it was that we were enjoying about it, we can engage with again. Even for instance, if one lost a position or one lost a friend or someone like this, then we can see those kinds of things coming back into our lives, of finding a different job or making more friends. This could even be a direct return of something good. So, for instance, if a friend has taken a long trip and you've been missing them, they can be coming back during this period of time. This can also indicate traveling back to a place, either that you've been to before or that you came from. We can also receive with this in Gemini fortunate replies to things. So even in terms of communications and messages and things like this, opportunities, even presenting themselves, in that written form that we typically associate with a Mercury retrograde because Jupiter is in Gemini in particular. This is also very favorable to revisions of works that you want to publish. So if you have done any sort of writing, or you've worked on a song or a painting or any sort of graphics or something like this that you've been wanting to publish, this can be a really excellent time to go back through it and clean it up to be published. So something that you've kind of put on the back burner, this would be a really wonderful time to come back to it, because it's very likely that you're going to get the best edits and revisionments of that. Additionally, when Jupiter is involved, we always have these questions of legal and philosophical and educational matters, and this would be coming back to that as well. So we could see the revisitation of a legal matter, revisiting a contract. So something that maybe we signed, if we want to renegotiate around that. This is a really great time to do that in order to get a win-win out of something. You could receive communications or something around any sort of legal matters that you're involved with that would bring some level of clarity. We can also revisit philosophical matters or receive some clarity around those in terms of our own worldview or our spirituality or our religion, just our philosophy generally speaking, if we go back and start to dig into what it is that we believe, it can then even broaden that for us. We could also dive into new topics if we wanted to. You can always do that with Jupiter, regardless of whether it's retrograde or direct. And additionally, educational matters. So this could be even deciding or thinking about going back to school or starting a semester again, like your first semester back. You could be taking a class again, and that this would be a very fortunate time to do that as well. So if you're able to take something that you may have had difficulty with in the past again, this would be very favorable for it. And in terms of legal matters, we especially want to look at the periods of time when we're closer to that 21 degree and 20 mark. So at the start of the retrograde and then at the end of the shadow period for legal matters, because there are legally oriented stars that are at that place as well. Additionally, any sort of course correction. So if you feel like you've gotten off course, this can really orient you, whether or not you're quite willing. And it can bring to your attention reconsiderations. And it is without a doubt doing this to benefit you because it's Jupiter. So new angles, new ways of looking at things, and getting a big picture can be really incredibly beneficial to you in terms of the course that your life is taking and the path that you're on. Now, further, one thing that we'll want to keep in mind is that opportunities when Mercury is retrograde can come in strange or like weird manner, like ways that you would not expect. So we do want to keep our eyes open because things can just present themselves out of the blue, and also in ways that can make us go like, huh? Like, wait, what? They can come through people that we never would have expected would have been able to offer us an opportunity. So definitely, be treating everyone well so that you can receive any sort of opportunities that might be available if you're nurturing those connections. But additionally, it could be even like learning about something that winds up becoming really important to you just by like channel surfing or something like this. It can come through in very weird ways. One thing that's very unique to this this Jupiter retrograde in particular is that, again, it's super indicative of really productive, supportive exchanges and communications, and especially when Mercury is in Libra, Aquarius, and Sagittarius throughout this period of time, when it's making those connections with this Jupiter, communications and conversations should go quite smoothly and in fact be much more enjoyable than one would expect or would be typical. So especially with things that you've already been dealing with, matters that are already kind of present in your life and that you are engaging with, there's a lot of development and going over things again and understanding things much more deeply and much more of rather than just something that something that is grounded then into a form of wisdom where you are enacting that knowledge, generally speaking, in your life, deepening knowledge, deepening understanding, things being relatively, especially again when this is in contact with Venus and Mercury, things should be relatively even-handed in terms of how people are dealing with each other. So there's a general improvement of one's perspective on matters, especially matters that you've already been dealing with. So again, for instance, if you have been studying a specific subject for a while and you feel like you may have, a decent grasp of it, as we go into this period of time, it is much, much, much more likely that sense of having a grasp on it is actually going to really deepen itself into, no, okay, I know this pretty thoroughly now. Like, I really feel like I understand this subject on a much more fundamental level. And again, once it goes direct, then we have even more opportunity to go through those things another time before we leave that shadow period. And additionally, this brings just straight up benefits, good news, opportunities, things coming in, things just kind of really going smoothly to this area of our chart. So I mentioned it generally speaking in terms of which signs that we are looking for. So we're going to look for sextiles, which are going to be Leo and Aries. We'll also look for the hard aspects, Sagittarius, Virgo, Pisces, Gemini here. These are going to be most strongly impacted. And even though they're hard aspects, it's Jupiter, it's fine, it's good. And additionally, the trines from Libra, Aquarius. So those are the signs that we will want to look at most closely. And anything that is in between 11 degrees and 21 degrees of those signs are going to get 3 hits of this. We've already had 1. We're going into our second with the retrograde, and then we'll get it direct as well. And it's bringing a huge amount of benefit to that area. We also want to look for the house. And in either a forthcoming, in a very short period of time, video, I'll take it through the houses, or I'll do that on the live this weekend to dig into which house this is in your chart. And so where you should be looking for those opportunities to be coming through. But they really should be kind of like knocking, you know. You're probably already kind of aware of where that's coming in. Now, just some additional interesting things about this one is that in late November through December, we could be dealing with topics that we dealt with in Virgo season. So this would have been mostly in August and September, because we had Mercury and Venus and the Sun all kind of go through that area in those months. And the reason that those things are coming up again to be dealt with is that we have another opportunity to deal with them and to develop them further. So the reason that I bring this up is that during that season, and it was about mid-August especially, that we had a big old T-square aspect pattern between Jupiter in Gemini, Saturn in Pisces, and then we had the inner planets in Virgo. It was first Venus, and then the Sun, and then Mercury. And so we had a series of those, but especially in mid-August, this came up quite sharply. And so a lot of what came through with that was people really sorting out, again, these big goals. It's an addition to the question that is being asked here, which is, again, what are you trying to achieve, and how are you going to achieve it the best way for you to be able to enjoy it, but to also efficiently get where you're trying to go so that it's sustainable in terms of reaching your destination as effectively as possible. So that came up for a lot of people. It was a little bit frustrating when we had this in Virgo, and I think that that's because there was a lot more emphasis then on Mercury of pulling all of the details apart, like taking the things apart to make them fit, rather than with Jupiter of coming into things in a much more easy way, of nice and easy opportunities that come in, answers that seem to come out of nowhere, and things like this that are generally associated with Jupiter itself rather than Mercury, which really needs to work through things. And so it can be a lot more frustrating to deal with. So because now what we're dealing with is not Mercury with Virgo, because then we had a lot of Mercury orientation with Jupiter and everything that was going through Virgo. Now it's a lot of Jupiter. So Jupiter is ruling all of the planets as they come through Sagittarius, and it's also ruling these planets that are in Pisces because it rules these signs. So the only planet that's ruled by Mercury that we're dealing with in this T-square that is asking a lot of the same questions would be Jupiter itself. Everyone else is basically trying to come to terms with Jupiter. So what I love about this is that it really orients more toward, yeah, how do we make this work for you? How do we make the details work? Rather than how are you going to sort out the details to figure out the plan to get to where you're wanting to go. I hope that that distinction is pretty clear. I don't want to belabor it too much, but it's more oriented toward the Jupiterian side of this, which is trying to find the enjoyment in it. That's what the focus is. That's what the priority is with Jupiter is this good? Is this easy? Does it just generally make sense? And is it coming to me in a way that's a lot easier rather than what are all of the details and how do we lay them out? So we're coming into a much easier configuration. And we will see that additionally next Pisces season when Jupiter is still in Gemini. And again, it'll be ruling the inner planets. Venus will move through faster. But when these guys come around and they're also in Pisces, Jupiter is still in charge. So this is something that we have to look forward to, where it's more along the lines of the plans sorting themselves out in favor of the goal rather than having to feel like you're almost adjusting the goal and the enjoyment of it in order to fit into the details. Now, additionally, toward the end of the retrograde, I think in February, just from what I'm seeing of it in the sense that I'm picking up of the connection to Aldebaran and the other planets that are involved, where we have a bit of an emphasis on water and air, I do feel like there's going to be some issues of precipitation, and I super don't love that because, man, that is not fun in Oklahoma in February. All our roads shut down. It's just a whole mess. But that could even be in the southern hemisphere where it's not going to be a question so much of snow and ice, but a question of rains and stuff that could be seen in early February that could be maybe a little bit overboard. Let's put it that way. Possibly not quite as problematic as the rains that we've seen just recently, but overboard. Now, as far as mundane astrology, let's dive into it, how this is going to impact the world. One thing that concerns me slightly about the retrograde here is that we do have this starting on some martially oriented stars, and they are beneficial stars, but Jupiter can also exacerbate matters. So this can be an enlargement or an escalation of war-related matters throughout this early period of time as well. And then as we come back to that, we will see some retribution for it. We will see some development in those matters, but it could be something that we see increasing, sadly, during this period of time as well. And the opposition from Mercury could even that out a little bit because of that mutual reception there, where they're both in each other's houses here. But more so, that is likely to bring legal challenges, so filings with regard to those matters. And Mercury also brings more coverage to these matters, especially this T-square, with that square between Jupiter and Saturn, these questions of governance and what our governments are doing. This brings a lot of coverage to that in terms of the media when Mercury is involved here. But this also brings this into international bodies with Mercury in Sagittarius and Jupiter at question here. So we could see some major developments within the UN with regard to major questions of governance and what's acceptable and what's not, as well as through international courts. So we could see some movement with regard to those matters. Now, let's take this through some various charts here where the Jupiter retrograde is making hard aspects to some of the placements in national charts for various countries. So looking at Lebanon, we see a couple problematic things coming up. Now, we see that Jupiter is coming very close to this Saturn right around the time of the retrograde. So this can lead to difficulties and challenges, as we've seen, that just seem very, very hard for the structure, which is already quite weakened, of the government and the international bodies that are functioning there to grapple with. As I hope we know, and if not, I will always preach this to everyone. One thing that's really important to understand about Lebanon is that they are home to a huge, huge, huge population of refugees from various countries. And they've been homing a huge amount of people. Last I checked, it was at least 30% of the population were refugees from Palestine, Iraq, Syria. And what we're currently seeing as Jupiter is coming really close to that Saturn is that they were already really beyond their functional breaking points for years with regard to all of that. And generally, always trying to make it work as much as possible, though it hasn't been. And now, because of the developments, because of Israel deciding to pivot their war machine more directed toward the north and more directed at Lebanon, we now see Lebanese, but then also especially Syrian and Palestinian refugees then now having to move into Syria, and then some people are fortunate and they're able to get farther away, but people who are less fortunate are only really able to cross the border. And of course, Israel is also bombing all of those crossings and trying to prevent those refugees from being able to get out and into Syria. We see also a huge amount of difficulties that they're grappling with in terms of flights aren't even able to function on schedule. So it's just a really impossible situation as this Jupiter is getting close to their Saturn, and Saturn tends to indicate major challenges that we face. And that's going to also be coming around and making a direct conjunction. Fortunately, it's just one direct conjunction in May of 2025, but obviously this is already just at a terrible point here. It has recently come into connection with this Mars as well, and really when any planet is coming into this area of the chart for Lebanon here, it's going to face difficulties because both of the malefics are in this close area. Of course, Mars also has to do with war and more immediate day-to-day challenges and complications, as well as violence. So sadly, because now Jupiter is moving so slowly, that Mars is being transited by it for a while from November to December, and it will get a shorter hit from it as it's moving direct again at a higher at a higher rate of speed in April of next year. And Jupiter is also forming a square aspect to this Chiron at 14 degrees, and that will hold throughout much of this whole retrograde because it's kind of smack in the middle of it. So it's not really going to leave orb throughout that whole period of time. So it looks like, and this is what I'm talking about when I say that Jupiter can exacerbate issues and it can enlarge and escalate issues. So it is a benefic, and there can be things that come out of the challenges that are faced during these periods of time. But again, when you're dealing with it in the moment, it can seem just absolutely catastrophic. I mean, I remember back in 2020 when Jupiter came around and was joining Mars and Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn. This was when we wound up locked down and we were all dealing with COVID, and everything just kind of seemed just way too much and impossible. Sometimes Jupiter can act that way. So very unfortunate, difficult to say. It looks like a lot of what Lebanon is dealing with right now, this retrograde isn't really going to be solving any of that until next year, at least. So looking at, and just a reminder, I don't have a time that's specific for Lebanon because the basis of the chart is when the French were pushed out, and we don't have an exact time, sadly, for when that happened. So for the states, this is happening in the 7th house, and we additionally have our Mars here. So it's actually, this Jupiter is parking on our Mars. And for the same reason that I just don't love what I just saw in the Lebanese chart, I don't love what I'm seeing in this chart either. So that Jupiter is quite potentially pulling us into a conflict. Again, we are dealing right now with a martial escalation and big questions around that and potential big problems around that. Now, of course, when this is being asked of us and we have a choice, we should be saying a lot more no during this period of time because of the fact that the states are within a position to really turn this down and to say, no, we're not going to engage in this escalation. But when Jupiter is involved with Mars in that way, it leans more toward getting involved, sad to say. So this is something that we've already been experiencing since late September, and that we will be dealing with throughout this month. And then we'll be dealing with it again from April through May of next year as well, which are these questions about how involved we're going to be getting in war-related matters. And this could present also difficulties to us that are related to that, but aren't directly like with that. So for instance, economic fallout or difficulty for people with, say, gas prices or shipping prices due to fuel costs because of a war getting out of control and there being supply issues. Now, additionally, toward the end of this retrograde, as it starts to park in the early degrees around 11, it will be in opposition to our ascendant as the US. So that, again, because it's parking here, that'll be holding from January through March of next year, and unfortunately indicates something that we typically do as the states, which is getting too involved in other people's matters. But it indicates significantly more of that in those months. So maybe somehow, I don't, I always want to be positive. I'm like, maybe we can just completely twist this fate and not get involved, I mean, that is an option, but knowing the leadership that we have in this country, I certainly wouldn't bet on it. And yeah. So for Palestine, this is mostly going to be getting close to an alignment with the nodal axis here. So this would very likely indicate kind of more of a stagnation of what they're dealing with currently, and then some twist along those lines, which should be fortunate around January, February, where there could be a good twist or a series of events that winds up helping in some form or fashion to what they're dealing with. But they do have some of the lesser involvement with this specific retrograde. And that is in their 11th house of allies. So that's actually kind of along the lines of, this whole time I've been saying like maybe a fortunate twist or something. I was kind of thinking about support. And again, one of the things that we do see with this is that UN international court involvement. And I think that may actually be something that we see with this Jupiter retrograde. And that would be that like slight little twist of fate where it's a screwed up, tragic situation that shouldn't be, but maybe it's a step closer to statehood. Maybe it's a step closer to some sort of accountability about what's happened, in terms of allies. And then also the organizations and institutions to which the nation belongs, like the UN now. So as far as Iran's chart is concerned, we do have some connections here as well. Again, close to Mars in a square pattern here. We have Gemini out here. I don't know of the exact time for Iran. I'm hoping that someone can maybe clarify to me. My understanding of this chart is that it's for a day that was declared, but I'm not sure if it was ahead of time or after or on the day to represent the independence. But it's also, I think, established on a basis that is associated with the equinox and may have to do with like a lunisolar calendar or something along those lines. So if someone can kind of explain to me a little bit more, at least just, was this proclaimed beforehand? In which case I would take midnight. If it was proclaimed on the day, then I would kind of want to narrow that down a little bit more as to when it was declared. But this is for midnight. So if you take midnight for Iran, then go for it. You can read the 7th house here. Now, it's going to be square to this Mars, or rather close to it, in October. And again, what we saw was an initial close call, an initial increase of martial involvement in a situation, which is what we see with Jupiter and Mars. Now, that's coming around again in May of next year. So again, we're seeing some weird stuff come up in April, May of next year, and I'm hoping that that isn't an indication of that being a time of escalation. But it could, based on how it's playing out in these various charts. Now, we also see throughout this whole period of time an extended period because it's so close to when that planet slows down, Jupiter slows down, stops for a while, and then goes backward slowly as well. From October through November of 2024, we have an opposition between that Jupiter and Neptune, which is calling on, again, those big picture ideals, questions around culture, questions around values, and those have certainly been being tested in recent days as well. And so we can continue to see that there may be more calls for more involvement from Iran as this time goes on as well. And those could be pretty convincing to that Neptune, where it's coming from well, someone's got to do something, on the other side kind of sense of the situation from their perspective. Again, I've kind of, I think, indicated so far what I've seen of this astrologically, which is that might not be the wisest, but again, I will say that, it's certainly not for me to judge that, because it's excruciating to be watching this situation unfold as it has. And if I were in that position, I don't know what I would do. So, I mean, I kind of know what I would do, and it would kind of be along the same lines, but we'll just put it that way. So the nodal axis is at 16 degrees of Virgo Pisces. And so that's also getting hit here, which is indicating a major significant series of events that we can expect in December and April, again, for Iran. So questions about, these are like historical pivot points for a country, periods of major significance looking back. So choices that are made that are very important. I did notice that there was a major nodal involvement in the killing of, or death of, depending on how you look at it, Raisi, the last president of Iran. Mars was tied to the North Node at that time when that happened. And so we do want to continue looking at nodal contacts with Iran as well, because we do see that that's definitely playing out for them, both the transiting nodes and their own nodes throughout this period of time. So I would expect to see something, a major development with regard to the country. But again, with the nodes, it's a little bit unpredictable as to how it's going to play out. It's just that something's going to be very significant, and it would probably be a positive turning point, or at least that's how it would be seen in the nation. Possibly not from like a Western perspective, but probably in terms of the perspective of the nation itself. So large portions of the population. So that's a lot of what I see in terms of the various countries that are getting strong aspects from this Jupiter retrograde. I will just do a little bit of US politics here, since we're in this election season and we all have big questions about this as well. It's definitely hitting both candidates' charts. And when it comes to the election day itself, I'll just go into this a little bit. That's when we have that opposition between Venus in Sagittarius and Jupiter in Gemini. The moon will also be there in Sagittarius with Venus. So that's one of the reasons why I think that we will see a very significant turnout of women, even more so than usual. What's also interesting about that specific alignment there, and why that in itself is making it very difficult for me and some other astrologers to really call the election. Elections are usually a lot more astrologically clean cut than this one. Let me put it that way. There are positive indications like crazy for both of the candidates, and it's that Jupiter retrograde that has a lot to do with that, because of the fact that both of these candidates have very significant Gemini placements. So, for instance, this Jupiter throughout the whole time in Gemini, that's all in Kamala Harris's first house. That's a wonderful place to have Jupiter. It's very, very fortunate. But additionally, as we'll see, and this also includes her nodal axis here, what we'll see with Trump is he also has a lot of Gemini placements. And so the fact that Jupiter's there with their placements, and then Venus is on the other side with some other placements in Sagittarius that they have, things start to get a lot more okay. They're, for some reason, both of these people are probably supposed to be running, so to say, but who's going to win? It's so not clear. And that's one thing that I want to explain. There's a lot of astrologers that I really respect who are withholding predictions on this. And I 100% agree with it because every way that I've looked at it, it's not clear enough who's going to win. So I just want to clear that up. But they're obviously all dealing with transits throughout this time. So I do want to point those out as well. Now, Kamala Harris is most quickly going to be having that Jupiter in a square aspect to this Venus. She has this little stellium. I do consider 3 planets a stellium in Virgo here. And it's going to be in turn making square aspects to all 3 of these. And again, keeping in mind that from Jupiter, as long as it's a pretty okay planet that it's connecting with, that should be pretty good. Now, so that's square first to her Venus in Virgo. And that'll be in late December or late November through December of this year, and then again in April. Now, she has a lot of stuff also in the interim, which are power-related planets for sure. Now, this could indicate that she's coming into something like that, where that Jupiter is going to be square to her Pluto, which is her own personal power, in early December of this year. Now, I think one thing also that a lot of astrologers that I respect, and certainly myself every freaking time that I'm looking at this, it's super frustrating, is it looks like a whole mess in terms of the election and the period after the election. There's a lot that's going on that looks like things are going to be held up and that there probably will be challenges to be dealt with after the election with regard to the results. So if that's the case, then things could certainly be held up until early December. That, as far as I understand, is when the votes are certified in terms of the electors. And then it's in January when we have the Congress deal with the whole situation that we never had to worry about until last time. But she will additionally be experiencing that kind of a weight of power, weight in terms of weightiness, the gravity of the power that she has within herself, also in March of 2025. So that, to me, if she's in the White House, would indicate some major question coming to her and her having to make a really big decision about it. Now, we'll also see that square to her Uranus later on. So late December of this year, early January of 2025. Now, that's a little bit more of a wild card. Jupiter Uranus is always going to be a bit of a wild card, but it's still generally pretty positive. So this could be a pleasant surprise to her, or events taking place in some sort of sequence that wasn't expected and that would be additionally very significant. So for instance, let me put it this way. What did we see last time that we had Uranus and Jupiter conjunct in the sky? Was the student protests around the war that's being waged on Gaza. So that wasn't something that one could necessarily predict as to what it would be, but it aligns perfectly well with Jupiter and Uranus. And of course, when those are in the sky, it can indicate uprisings for positive causes and collective action toward those ends and things like that. But when we're seeing that natally, what we can see is, again, these kinds of surprise or things that are coming into a sequence that are not quite expected. It could also rev her up to push for some changes. So for instance, if she's finding out, okay, things are set in place and I'm going to be able to make some changes, maybe this is kind of lighting a fire under her around some of the changes that she'll be wanting to make. And so we'll see that in December leading into January, and then we'll also see it in March just before it comes back to Pluto and then to Venus again. Now, in terms of Donald Trump, so he has his Gemini stuff up here. This Jupiter retrograde is stationing pretty close to his sun and pretty much right on his north node. So we would take these to be very positive transits for him. They're very fortunate transits for him. It's additionally in opposition to his moon, which is at 21 degrees of Sagittarius. And of course, that south node is down there as well. So this is hitting his most personal, significant placements here, and it's Jupiter. So we would expect to see a lot of luck with this, as well as a lot of attention coming to him. So this could be something that plays out strongly in his favor. We could have a major October surprise. Again, if we see escalation, that could complicate things politically, and this could kind of tilt things in his favor in a strong way. And that, again, will be coming up in April, May of next year for him. Now, there are some more funky things in April that are coming up for him as well that we'll want to look at later down the road. So again, this would be benefits coming to him that aren't even necessarily initiated by him. They could just be fortunate things that just kind of fall in his lap during this period of time. As much as I just really don't like to say those words. So again, we have that moon, we have that nodal axis is all bound up in that. Notice it's October, November, and May of next year. And then we have this Uranus at 17 degrees of Gemini, and that's going to be hit by that Jupiter in late November, December. This could be a fight that he's putting up. So if this doesn't put him over the edge, then there could be him getting really rearing up in terms of his strategy to contest things and to generally challenge the election system, either legally with Jupiter involved or otherwise. And by legally, I mean involving our courts, you know. And then again, that also comes up in April of 2025. And that's along the lines of some of the kind of funkier things where it's not as clean cut. This is a good thing in terms of transits for him. It could be a really pleasant surprise. But depending on how we see this play out, with him, you could see this going a little bit more radical and you know, bucking the status quo of how things are typically done. So I hope that this was all of help. I think that this is a time that's coming up that certainly presents a lot of challenges globally, but in terms of our own personal lives, there's a lot to be really loved about this Jupiter retrograde. It's going to present a lot of opportunities to us in interesting and ways that we probably would not have been looking for them. It has a strong indication of communication playing out in a much more positive fashion than typical throughout this period of time too, and being able to connect with people well. So I'm personally looking forward to it, and I certainly hope it treats you well. I, again, will be doing another video either during the live stream on Sunday or in a separate video. I'll be taking this through the houses to point out where this is going to be most significantly playing out for you. But yeah, until then, I hope that this is a super enjoyable time. And again, if you are new here, please do consider sticking around if this video was of interest to you. This is pretty much the bread and butter of the stuff that we do here. And I would love to have you here for future videos. And again, if you don't mind hitting the thumbs up button, that helps me out a huge time. So I very much appreciate that. And if you are interested in joining the Facebook group that we have, where we discuss these transits and events and things like this astrologically, then that is also in the description to join. And otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful time, and I will see you very soon. Be good. Bye.